We could be on the cusp of a major announcement from Nintendo about Breath of the Wild 2. Now, it's been a while and we sure are hungry for new information, but with that in mind I thought it would be a good time to round up everything Nintendo has said about Breath of the Wild 2. So today I'm going to be checking out interviews with key Nintendo staff and going over all the details with you. Well, if you're new around here or find this useful, don't forget to hit that subscribe button down below for all the latest Legend of Zelda content and turn on notifications by hitting that bell. Well, without further delay, let's dive into everything Nintendo has said about Breath of the Wild 2. Well, first of all, we've got an interview with IG Aonuma from Brian Shea. This one is on June the 11th in 2019, and that is from Game Informer. So Brian says direct sequels are rare in Zelda titles, but Aonuma saw something special about Breath of the Wild and wanted to create a new experience. Aonuma said, "One of the reasons we wanted to create a continuation was because I wanted to revisit that Hyrule again and use that world again while incorporating new gameplay and a new story," he says. During the conversation, Aonuma confirmed that Hidemaru Fujibayashi will be returning to the directorial role for the sequel of Breath of the Wild. And Aonuma says, "We are working together really hard on this game." When asked if he's given himself more time to complete the Breath of the Wild sequel than he was given for Majora's Mask, and that was famously created in less than a year, Aonuma laughs, "When I was making Majora's Mask, the timeline was in a year. I was a little stubborn, and I was going to make it from scratch, and it was really going to be gung-ho, but it turns out the staff are a little tired from that process. I've learned to give myself plenty of time. You don't want to do it that way, or else you're going to get white hair just like me." And Aonuma also confirmed that players will not need an expansion pack to play Breath of the Wild sequel, as they did for Majora's Mask on the Nintendo 64, saying, "It's going to be a continuation, and it will come in full form as it is." So here, IG Aonuma confirms the fact it is a full sequel, continuing straight after the events of the original Breath of the Wild. Not many Zelda games get a direct sequel, and I do think it's a good thing Nintendo didn't take the same approach as Majora's Mask. So yes, we would have got the game quicker, but Majora's Mask was such a specific style of game. Given the Zelda team have been working on this now for a number of years, that gives me great confidence it's going to live up to the original Breath of the Wild. Well, next up we've got another interview with IG Aonuma, and this one is from Jason Schreier from the 18th of June 2019 when he was working at Kotaku. So Schreier says, "What made you and the team decide to make a sequel to Breath of the Wild as opposed to a new Zelda game?" Aonuma replies, "When we released the DLC for Breath of the Wild, we realised this is a great way to add more elements to the same world, but when it comes down to some technical things, DLC is pretty much data. You're adding data to a pre-existing title. And so, when we wanted to add bigger changes, DLC is not enough. And that's why we thought maybe a sequel would be a good fit." Schreier goes on to ask, "Was this sequel originally planned as a DLC?" And Aonuma replies, "Initially, we were thinking of it just as DLC ideas, but then we had a lot of ideas and said, this is just too many ideas. Let's just make one new game and start from scratch." Well, IG Aonuma goes into some detail here about why they're making the sequel, given the new gameplay mechanics, and the fact that Nintendo wanted to add bigger changes to the game makes me really excited about the gameplay elements that they're going to add. We've already seen some of these through trailers and also patents, with the time reversal, travelling through solid matter, and also hints in the patents at aerial combat, although we're yet to see in those trailers. I do have a good video that I made about that, and you can check this one out here. Well, next up, Sam Claiborne interviews IG Aonuma. This one is from the 28th of June 2019, and this one comes from IGN. So just for a little bit of context, this was off the back of the first trailer they released in 2019, and all the staff at IGN were very, very excited about it. So Sam says, "I have to ask about that trailer. Everybody is buzzing with excitement, and it seems like this was a dark twist on Breath of the Wild. It reminded me of Majora's Mask. Was that on purpose?" Aonuma replies, "The new Breath of the Wild, or the sequel to it, it's not necessarily going to be related to Majora's Mask or inspired by it. It just so happened to be what we showed you is currently a little bit darker, and we're honestly still in production, so we can't really say exactly how it's going to be turning out." Sam follows up with another question saying, I know for a long time people have wanted to play as Zelda, and there's been some games where you get to play as Zelda a little bit. So it looked like Zelda and Link were hanging out a lot together. Do you think this is going to be a game where we get to play as Zelda, maybe in a co-op game? Alnuma says, it is kind of interesting that you bring that up, because in Breath of the Wild, you see Zelda and Link together often too. So to go straight to the thought of co-op is very interesting to me. And later on in the interview, Sam goes on to say, what recent open world games have you been playing that you draw inspiration from? Probably the sequel that we just found out about today. Alnuma says, well, recently I have been very busy, especially with Link's Awakening, and this interview was around the time of the press all about Link's Awakening, so Alnuma must have been very, very tired indeed. And Alnuma continues saying, so the thing is, on my breaks I've also been playing Cadence of Hyrule, and I've really just been overloaded with loads of Zelda games recently. So Sam follows up with, what is a game that you keep on hearing younger members of staff talk about and that inspires them? Alnuma replies, I do remember when I was working on Breath of the Wild, Mr. Fujibayashi was the director and he was playing Skyrim. Another thing I did hear about, there were a lot of people, they were playing Red Dead Redemption 2. So Alnuma here reiterates that Breath of the Wild 2 isn't going to be like Majora's Mask, just that the first E3 2019 trailer was much darker, and Nintendo put that right when they showed off their next trailer at E3 2021, where the trailer setting was much brighter and it showed everything above ground rather than the dark, creepy setting of the first trailer underground. Alnuma expertly dodges the playable Zelda question there from Sam, rightly pointing out that we do see Zelda and Link together in the first game quite a lot, and Zelda wasn't playable there. He didn't outright confirm nor deny, so I do think that left fans with a lot of hope that in fact we are going to see a playable Zelda. I'd really like to see a playable Zelda in a mainline Zelda game. I think it is time to do it. Also at the end we do have confirmation of Skyrim and Red Dead Redemption 2 as inspirations for the latest Legend of Zelda games. Well, next up we have some interesting Nintendo job listings. This is from the 5th of July 2019. This one was featured in Games Radar. So Nintendo recently shared Japanese listings for terrain designers and level designers, contract positions, both of which mention dungeons. So the listings are mostly composed of standard information such as preferred experience and potential compensation. However, the descriptions of the jobs themselves gives us a little bit more insight into the Zelda Breath of the Wild sequel. So the terrain designer position will work on parts of the game such as field dungeons, and the level designer will work on game event, dungeon and field planning. So the latter position will also help with work on creating and tweaking enemies, just in case you were worried the sequel wouldn't expand on the Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. It has a relatively limited cast of enemies. So although this isn't a specific interview, it is Nintendo posting job listings looking for specific skills. So field dungeons and game event dungeon field planning, they all sound really promising when it comes to the addition of old school Zelda dungeons being in the sequel to Breath of the Wild. Although you probably could consider the Divine Beasts as dungeons. Hopefully we're going to have more information when Nintendo shows us that next trailer. Well, next up we've got an interview with Bill Trinan by Matt Kim. This one came out on the 17th of June 2021, and this one once again is from IGN. So officially, Nintendo is calling the game the sequel to Breath of the Wild. This is because the game will have a proper subtitle, just not one Nintendo is ready to reveal just yet. As for why we're holding back on the name, you're just going to have to stay tuned, because obviously Zelda names are kind of important, Trinan says during the interview. Those subtitles, they start to give little bits of hints about maybe what is going to happen. Breath of the Wild 2 is going to be shorthand. It's natural for people to want to find a shorthand way to frame it. We're still calling it the sequel to Breath of the Wild, says Trinan. After the E3 2021 trailer, we got more from Nintendo and Bill Trinan during interviews with IGN, and apparently this points to some plot spoilers in the name of the game, although it is hard to look at some of the names of the games and understand the theme or the plot. I can see what you're talking about in Ocarina of Time. That makes sense. There was an ocarina, you were travelling through time. But Breath of the Wild didn't really give too much away. Skyward Sword, well, yes, maybe that hints at being in the sky, and the Master Sword is a big theme. And then you've got Twilight Princess. Both of those titles, I think, are ambiguous enough. There are rumours that the name will be Breath of Duality. And that certainly makes sense from a thematic point of view. If we're going to be switching between Link and Zelda, maybe switching between the sky and the earth, above ground or underground, or maybe even switching between dimensions. Well, let me know in the comments what you think about Nintendo has said on Breath of the Wild 2, and let me know what you want to see from that new trailer. Well, that is it for this look at everything Nintendo has said about Breath of the Wild 2, and as always, thank you so much for watching or listening. For more Zelda content like this, hit that subscribe button down below and subscribe to Triforce Times. Or you can check me out on Twitter at Triforce Times. If you enjoyed this video and found it useful, liking and sharing the video would really help me out. Otherwise, check out the other videos on the channel. Well, thanks again. I'll see you soon.